Let's look at some confused arguments for relativism. So we looked at cannibalizing arguments, some self-refuting arguments. Here are some arguments for relativism that people use that don't really get them where they want to go. Roman numeral 5, confused arguments for relativism. A, the argument from disagreement. And this is the main argument for cultural relativism. This is the one that people use more than any other argument. And it's a simple argument. It goes like this. Premise 1. Different cultures have different moral codes. Conclusion. Thus, there are no objective moral truths. There are no universal moral truths that apply to all people at all times. So we've kind of seen this argument in other forms before. Now we're making it quite explicit. The main argument for cultural relativism, the main argument for subjectivism, is that there's so much disagreement about moral issues. There can't be an objectively right answer to moral questions. It's got to be relative. It's got to be up to us, something that we construct, either individually or as a culture. One of the main problems with this argument is that it suffers from a logical defect. And this is something that all logicians would agree with. The argument is what we call in logic invalid. An invalid argument is one where the conclusion doesn't follow from the premise. That if an argument's invalid, it makes sense to accept the premise but deny the conclusion. The two things aren't so connected that if you accept one, you should accept the other. The opposite of an invalid argument is a valid argument. And that's an argument where the conclusion does follow. That if you accept the premises of the argument, you should, if you want to be rational, accept the conclusion. So here's an example of a valid argument. One that if you accept the premises, you should accept the conclusion. This is called the Kalam cosmological argument for God's existence. Everything that begins to exist has a cause, first premise. Second premise, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, thus the universe has a cause. This argument is valid because if you accept premise 1 and premise 2, you ought to accept the conclusion. It doesn't make any sense to say, I agree with premise 1, I agree with premise 2, but I'm not sure about the conclusion. Or it doesn't make any sense to say premise 1 is true, premise 2 is true, but the conclusion is clearly false. If you accept these two, you ought to accept the conclusion. The conclusion follows from the premises. That's a valid argument. An invalid argument is one where the conclusion doesn't follow. So here's a clear instance of an invalid argument. Premise 1, today is Saturday, therefore God exists. You can accept this premise and still deny the conclusion, and there's nothing irrational about that. The premise doesn't imply the conclusion. The conclusion doesn't follow from that premise, even if the premise is true. So, the main argument for cultural relativism, the argument from disagreement. Different cultures have different moral codes. That's the premise. If the argument's invalid, then it's possible that it's rational to accept that premise, but not accept the conclusion. To say, yeah, different cultures have different moral codes. What does that have to do with whether what makes an act right or wrong is whether the culture approves or disapproves of it? What does that have to do with the nature of morality? It doesn't seem to have much to do with it. Because there are lots of things that people disagree about, and we don't go to the relativist conclusion even when we realize there's disagreement. Here are similar invalid arguments to the argument from disagreement. Different cultures have different scientific beliefs. This is true. Different ones have different scientific beliefs. Thus, there are no objective scientific truths. That just doesn't follow. Just because cultures disagree doesn't mean there are no objective scientific truths. Different cultures have different religious beliefs. That's definitely true. But it doesn't make any sense to infer from that. Thus, there is no objective truth about whether God exists. Well, either God exists or he doesn't. There's a fact of the matter. We might not know what the right answer is. We might have the obligation to be skeptical that we know the right answer. But there is definitely a uniquely correct answer to the question, does God exist? It doesn't become relative just because different cultures have different religious beliefs. Let's go to problem 2 then, that this argument is inconsistently applied. So not only is the argument invalid, but no one uses it consistently, which is a problem, because if you're going to buy into the argument, you should use it wherever it applies. And when it comes to politics, people are reluctant to make that move, to say, oh, people have different political beliefs. Therefore, there are no objective political truths. If there's any place where there's as much disagreement as there is about morality, it's politics. And yet, when it comes to politics, people know others are disagreeing with them. But that doesn't make them conclude, well, everyone's right. Every view is equally correct. No, they say, my view is correct, you're wrong, even though you disagree with me. In fact, that's why we disagree, because one of us thinks we're right, and the other one is wrong. So people don't say, oh, we can't agree about the justice of the Iraq War. Therefore, there is no right answer to that question. It's all subjective. It's all relative. Now, people say we can't agree, but there is a right answer. That's why we keep holding to our view. That's why we keep arguing about it. Think about the question of whether the president is a good president. How many people would say, oh, that's just all relative? No, they think they've got the right answer to that question. Is the president a good president? And not only that, they think that people who disagree with them are not only wrong, but they're immoral for disagreeing with them. So, if you're going to apply that argument from disagreement to morality, you should be willing to apply it to politics. But hardly anyone is willing to apply that argument to politics. And then let's skip problem 3 and go to problem 4. How much disagreement is there? We've pointed out several problems with the argument. Different cultures have different moral beliefs. Therefore, there are no objective moral truths. We've talked about how it's invalid, how the argument is inconsistently applied. But some philosophers would actually point to another problem, which is that first premise doesn't seem entirely true, that different cultures have different moral codes. I mean, obviously there are differences, but some would argue that there aren't as many differences as we might expect, that the amount of disagreement between people isn't as great as we think. But what if that disagreement is masked by a more basic or more fundamental agreement on other moral truths? I mean, when you think about it, it does look like we disagree about morality all the time. But that's because we only focus on the issues that we disagree on. We don't focus on the issues that we agree on because, well, we agree on them. What's the point in talking about them? And when it comes to the most basic, the most obvious truths of morality, people pretty much agree on a lot of things. Here are some examples. Don't kill your children just because you're tired of raising them. That seems like a moral truth most people would accept. Imagine a society in which honesty, justice, and courage and self-control are evil, and lying, cheating, stealing, cowardice, betrayal, addiction, and despair are good. You can't imagine a society like that because the society would die out quickly. Any society that's surviving tends to prefer honesty, justice, courage, and self-control to those other things. Here's another moral truth that most people accept. It is better to strive to promote our universal good and welfare than continually strive for the ruin and destruction of all. Or the claim rape is wrong. A lot of people agree to that one. Hunting your neighbor for sport is wrong. Helping the poor is good. When was the last time someone had a really serious disagreement about whether helping the poor is a good thing? When was the last time you came across someone who said, oh, helping the poor is so evil, it's disgusting? Most people agree. It's good. We have a right to life. Children aren't as morally responsible as adults. Equals should receive equal treatment. Or cheating on your spouse is wrong. Most people would agree with those moral truths. We could come up with lots of them. We could just multiply examples of obvious moral truths that most people accept in some way or other. So maybe there isn't as much disagreement as we think. And maybe some of the stuff that we think is disagreement is really disagreement about something else entirely. You see, when people disagree about moral issues, sometimes it's not the morality of the action that they're really disagreeing about. It's really a disagreement about something else that sort of manifests itself in their moral judgments. For instance, suppose there's an Eastern religion that says eating beef is wrong. And in the culture of the United States, eating beef seems to be perfectly acceptable. So it would seem like those two cultures have a significant difference, a significant disagreement in their views about what it's okay to eat. One says eating beef is okay, the other says eating beef is wrong. But suppose that in that Eastern culture, the reason they think eating beef is wrong is because they believe in reincarnation. And they believe that sometimes their dead loved ones become reincarnated as animals, as cows, for instance. Well, now the disagreement takes on a different look, because you actually agree with the person who says you shouldn't eat meat. If you agree, or if you say that it's okay to eat meat, you actually agree on something. What you agree on is that you shouldn't eat grandma. What you disagree over is where grandma is. The person who says don't eat beef thinks grandma may be inhabiting a cow. You don't think grandma is inhabiting a cow. So you both agree on a more basic moral fundamental principle. Don't eat grandma. What you disagree over is this metaphysical issue of whether there's life after death, whether there's reincarnation, and how we become reincarnated. Or think about the burning of witches. That's supposed to be an example of a time in the United States where the culture seemed to be completely different from ours because they burned witches. Well, maybe their moral beliefs aren't so different from ours because we just don't believe in witches. We don't believe there are witches. That's why we don't punish them. But suppose you really did believe that some people were witches. Suppose you really did believe that some people were causing mass starvation and famine because they had magical powers. You'd probably think we should do something about it, that we got to keep them from killing lots of people. You would think they ought to be punished in some way. You would agree deep down that doing that causing famine as a witch is wrong. You agree with the people who existed in the United States long before, who burned witches. You both agree that if a witch does that, it's wrong, and that they ought to be punished. You may disagree over the type of punishment, but you still think they ought to be kept from doing that. What you disagree over is whether there are any witches at all. And so what looks like a really significant moral disagreement is more of a disagreement in something else, in metaphysics and science, and what sorts of things exist. That disagreement is masking a more fundamental agreement that we deep down share about lots of moral issues.